Good afternoon, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Today, we are joined by Andrea Mosterman and Tom Ruller. Andrea Mosterman is Associate Professor of Atlantic History and Joseph Tregel Professor in Early American History and Jara Johnson Professor in World and Maritime History at the University of New Orleans. Andrea has earned the university's Faculty Excellence in Teaching and Teaching Innovation Award. Her course subjects include Atlantic History, Early American History, and Comparative Slavery. Some of her most recent courses include Historical Thought and Writing, Silences and Biases in the Archives, and The Spatial Turn. She incorporates projects such as the Unessay and poster presentations, and when possible, visits to local archives, museums, or historical sites to encourage exploration of the history that surrounds us. Today, we explore the thesis of Professor Mosterman's recent book, Spaces of Enslavement, A History of Slavery and Resistance in Dutch New York, the manuscript for which won the New Netherland Institute's annual Hendricks Award, which recognizes exceptional scholarship on the 17th century Dutch mid-Atlantic settlement of New Netherland, its colonial context, and its legacy. Thomas J. Ruller recently retired from his position as New York State Archivist, a role he has held since 2015. Here, Tom's oversaw care and access to the nearly 400 years worth of New York's colonial and state records, including exquisite records of colonial New Netherland, many of which Professor Mosterman consulted for her research on today's topic. An active professional for 35 years, Tom is the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. Tom has been a consultant for several state governments and other organizations focusing on electronic records management and preservation. He remains actively engaged as a board member and steward of the Archives Partnership Trust. So for those of you who have joined us today, welcome. And I do want to let you know that there will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll set aside a few minutes at the end to get to as many of those as we can. And now I am pleased to introduce Andrea Mosterman and Tom Ruller.
Thank you very much, Josie, and hello, Andrea. It's good to see you.
Yeah.
I think we're both, actually everybody on the East Coast of the U.S., from New Orleans, where you are, to Fort Myers, where I am, to Albany, where Josie is, are enjoying some beautiful, beautiful weather. So it's great for us to have an opportunity to sort of enjoy the great day and talk about an amazingly interesting book and on an amazingly interesting topic. I have to say, I really enjoyed the book, and because it takes a really, I think, unique and important perspective on the enslavement, the lives of the enslaved, using New Netherland as the lens. And I think that's really, really important. So let's start off with something pretty simple. I want to talk a little bit about what Spaces of Enslavement means. That's a perfect title. In your book, you suggest it means more than just where people lived and where people worked. It seems to be more about the systematic organization of spaces, whether they're personal or community, that was used to surveil, control, and segregate enslaved individuals. Can you talk a little bit more about the concept of spaces of enslavement?
Absolutely. And first of all, thank you so much for having me. Thanks to Josie and the New York Archives Magazine and Partnership Trust. It's been the New York State Archives have been very important to my research. So it's really nice to be here and share some of that with all of you. So the idea of spaces of enslavement really comes out of, in part, what's oftentimes the way that slavery in New York oftentimes was talked about is this idea that enslaved and free New Yorkers shared various spaces, including the church and the home, the streets. And what I found increasingly as I was doing my research is that the term sharing is problematic because it does not consider the power dynamics that are an important part of that. And that indeed these spaces are not so much like mutual spaces where enslaved and free people lived, which in many ways is obvious, right? But really in the literature, that's not how it is portrayed. But that these were places that were used to really ensure that the institution of slavery could exist and be sustained in New York. And I say New York more so than New Netherlands, because one of the interesting things that actually you see over time is that whereas in the Dutch colonial period, these various spaces are not controlled in the same way. There's no legislation. There's no when it concerns enslaved people. There's no clear organization in homes or churches. This is something that developed over the course of the 18th century in early New York, where increasingly those spaces are used to, like you said, control, monitor, and surveil the enslaved population.
Very good. And I think that's, to me, that spoke so much within the book. And let's talk a little bit about where people lived. Many enslaved individuals cohabitated with their enslavers. But can we explore a little bit about what the difference was between the enslaver and the enslaved in terms of their living situation?
Yeah, and again, that goes back to this idea of, like they're in the same space, but really they're not. And they're not in the same space physically, but also emotionally, the way they experience those spaces would have been very different. So first of all, when you see the various like Dutch American homes, some of them still standing in New York, of course, in those spaces, the enslaved people would not have been living or doing most of their labor in the spaces where the Dutch American families were. They would have been living in the cellars or in the garret spaces, sometimes in the attics. They would have been working in those cellars, sometimes behind the houses. So where they labored and where they lived was very different. And so they would have navigated those spaces differently. They would have experienced those spaces differently. Sojourner Truth talks about the cellar in which she lives as, water is standing, the floor is muddy, not at all like when you actually go into the spaces that free people lived in the 18th century. The emotional part is similarly important, is that people actually would not have experienced those spaces in the same way. So if we take these houses for Dutch American families, they would have represented family, hospitality, safety in many cases. But of course, for enslaved people, those spaces would not have had the same meaning. I think especially where oftentimes enslaved people did not live with family members. These would not have been spaces of family. In fact, their family oftentimes lived elsewhere. If they did live with family members, there was the constant knowing that these family members could be taken away from them, that they could be separated from them. They're in these spaces, they were spaces of forced labor, of oftentimes abuse, neglect. And so it also would have been a very different experience in those spaces, not just because they're physically like in different parts of the home, but also just because of what those spaces meant and how they would have experienced their lives in those areas.
You talked a little bit about forced labor and the work that enslaved individuals did, particularly in New Netherland. The New Netherland colony didn't have a significantly labor-intensive commerce like the Deep South did, or the sugar plantations of the Caribbean or South America. So what kind of work were enslaved individuals responsible for performing in New Netherland and 18th century New York?
Yeah. So in the Netherlands, we see that they're actually very important, in part simply for the peopling of the country. So to actually provide people that are there part of the Dutch settlement. They work in various jobs. So they help with the infrastructure, the deforesting, working in the harbors and domestics, on the farms, on the tobacco plantations, which the Dutch did have in these areas. So they did have, some plantations. We see enslaved people who actually worked as executioners, and enslaved people who fought in wars against the indigenous populations during the Aesopus Wars, for example, enslaved people were part of the Dutch troops. So a wide-ranging, wide variety of tasks, and really proved important in helping build the colony during those early years for the Dutch. In New York, it's becomes more. In New Netherlands, a lot of the enslaved people, in fact, early on, most of them were enslaved by the Dutch West India Company. But later on in the 18th century, we see that enslaved people were enslaved by individuals. And so in most cases, you know, that depended on the enslavers, but they would have done jobs like working in the harbors, in the ports. They would have worked in the homes, domestic labor, all types of, you know, food preparation and mending of clothing, cooking, of course. Coachmen, enslaved people usually were the coachmen. There was, you know, they were assisting in the workplace. So it was really very wide ranging, but also a lot of farm labor. A lot of enslaved people worked on the farms. And for example, Kings County, what is now Brooklyn, New York, Ulster County, places like that, we see that many of them also worked on the local farms.
I think it's important for all of us to remember the context in which many of these people were living in from the early part of the 17th century through the 18th century. New York was not this bustling metropolis. New York State was not this well-developed place. As you point out, they had to deforest the land in order to farm it. They had to build the bridges over the rivers and creeks in order to go from one place to another. You mentioned that many of the enslaved people were enslaved by the Dutch West India Company. So the company owned people as property. Is that okay? And in that, I didn't ask you this question before, so it comes a little bit of a as things changed and the Dutch West India Company stops operating in New York in 1664, so the English take over. Do the individuals who are enslaved by the company, are they now sold off to individuals, or do the British, the English government, do they take over the ownership of these people?
So some of I mean, this is a really good question, actually, one that I am still exploring, because it kind of depends on who the people are. So some of them are sold right before the English take over. Others are confiscated. There's actually enslaved people in the Newer Amstel colony, New Amstel in the Delaware, who get confiscated by the English and sold in Maryland to various plantations there. So it kind of depends on who they are. But in many cases, they were confiscated by the English, or they were sold before the English could confiscate them. But yeah, it's a very interesting period that actually I haven't fully delved in deeply in the book, but actually for my new project I am. So hopefully I will be able to give you a much more detailed answer once that book is out.
Well, we look forward to that book. So thank you. In the book, you talk a bit about the taverns and their role in New Netherland as a community space. And it was a community space for the enslaved as well as the enslavers. And can you tell us more about where free and enslaved people were able to mix and what the tavern life was like for both sets of people?
Yeah. So one of the things about New Netherlands is that, like I said at the beginning, there was no legislation that kind of restricted enslaved people from purchasing alcohol or frequenting these places, which there would be later on in the 18th century. And so in the 17th century, we see, and it continues in the 18th century, but it's, you know, then it's more like underground. Whereas in the 17th century, enslaved and free people, you know, would be able to mingle in these taverns. There is some evidence that suggests that certain taverns were were preferred by the West India Company, says, and by some of the other enslaved people. So I do suspect that they may have been, you know, seeking out those spaces where they could meet with each other. But they would have also interacted with white settlers in those spaces, absolutely. And that is a big change later on, where they no longer where enslaved people are actually no longer allowed to purchase alcohol, cannot, meet in larger groups, and various legislation that really changes that. That freely mingling in these spaces.
In the church, the Dutch Reformed Church in particular, was another place where enslaved and free people were able to participate together and really worship together. And you have a few stories in the book of individuals who went on to become domini or rise up to positions within the Dutch Reformed Church. But how did the role of the church as a gathering place evolve over time, particularly for the enslaved people?
Yeah. So in the 17th century, we see enslaved people actually baptizing their children in the Dutch Reformed Church of New Amsterdam, so now New York City. They marry in that church, and this is one of the reasons why we know so many of their names. Over time, there's fewer and fewer enslaved Africans in the Dutch Reformed churches. And this starts in the latter part of the 17th century and continues throughout most of the 18th century. And this, once again, is one of these areas where, whereas in the 17th century, there was no legislation and no kind of regulation of enslaved people in those spaces, over the course of the 18th century, we see more and more people kind of restricting them from accessing that space. And this is for various reasons. Very likely, congregations did not want enslaved people in their churches because, of course, the idea that they could be like seen as equal before God could also challenge the social hierarchy of their communities. And I should note that there are congregations that continue to have enslaved people in their churches, but most of them do not. Or in certain time periods they do, in other periods they don't. In Albany, for example, there's a brief period where a lot of enslaved people are accepted in the church in the 18th century, but then other time periods we see fewer. And so it kind of depends on the congregation, but it also depends on the enslavers, whether or not they want their enslaved people in the church. And again, this was for people really a challenging issue. Like, can you enslave a fellow Christian? And that is likely one of the reasons why enslaved people were not in those churches so often. And then when they were, they would oftentimes, in the 17th century, there's no clear indication of where in the space they would have been. But we do know that in the 18th century, when they would have been in those churches, they likely were there either in the pew with their enslavers, or standing in the back, or in the aisles. By the latter part of the 18th century, when we see the number of free and enslaved Black people in these churches, they were usually restricted to the back. So there was like a physical as well as a temporal segregation. They were seated in back benches, either on the first floor or the second floor, but also they could usually not get communion until all the white congregants had done so. So there was also that separation. So those are some of the developments that we see in the church and the ways in which the church, and important here, and this is why I talk about the church as a social power in the Dutch Reformed Church, having membership in the church, being accepted within these Dutch Reformed churches and many of these communities also meant that you had more opportunities within the community as a whole. And we see that in the 17th century when enslaved people, when they convert to or when they participate in the Dutch Reformed Church, use the fact that they're Christians in their petitions. They always refer to this. So it gives enslaved people opportunities. And so taking that away from them also lessens their opportunities within these communities to kind of navigate them successfully.
You mentioned in the book that many of the enslaved, particularly enslaved Africans, were Christians really before the time of enslavement, or as part of the process of enslavement. Can you talk a little bit about how these folks moved into the Christian religion or Christian perspective?
Yeah. So we know from the names of these enslaved people and kind of also from the larger history and the shipping records and such, but we know that Most of these enslaved people are coming from West Central Africa, Angola, Congo, Sao Tome, Santo Tome. And those were all areas where Christianity had spread. In the Kingdom of Congo as early as 1491, the King of Congo actually converts to Catholicism. By the 17th century, when we see these people being brought to New Netherlands, Christianity had spread in Congo and Angola and in surrounding areas quite extensively. So we know it from the regions that they're coming from, but also we can see it from their names, not just because the last name is from Angola or from Congo, but also because they have Catholic, Portuguese Catholic names. Like Domingo is very common, Anthony is very common. So we can also see it from their names that they have these Catholic names when they are brought to New Netherlands.
Thank you. One of the things that you do in your book is you challenge the position of some scholars that enslavement in New Netherland was less brutal than it was in other places. Certainly, there's a difference in working on a sugarcane plantation and maybe working on a farm in upstate New York, but that's the form of labor. Can you talk a little bit more about your perspective of the treatment of the enslaved in New Netherland as it is compared to the treatment of enslaved people elsewhere?
Yeah, and I mean, I would say that this is the case for New Netherlands and for New York, right? Like extending into the 18th century, the narratives are slightly different. So in the case of New Netherlands, there are several enslaved people are able to obtain conditional freedom and eventually full freedom. And that has been those are the people who also appear in the records more often. They're mentioned more often. And so historians have really focused in on their histories. And I do the same because those are the histories we can tell. But what we're missing then is the fact that there's a lot of enslaved people there who actually were not able to have those same opportunities. And we also know from the Dutch West India Company records, for example, that enslaved people also worked in chained gangs. Now, in the case of New York, there it comes to this idea of the sharing of spaces. Like they worked alongside on the farms and they worshiped in the same churches and they lived in the same homes. And that has become a very prominent narrative and really comes out of kind of like 19th century abolitionist literature that, you know, to kind of position itself against the US South. Like, how do you do that when just like a generation ago, you too were enslaving people? Well, you can do that by kind of telling a story of slavery having been more benign in New York. And there, the focus oftentimes was on the labor, but of course, slavery is much more than the labor that they produce. And really what's the thing that distinguishes slavery from any other kind of labor, any social or class, is the fact that you do not, according to the law, like you have no self-ownership, right? Like you are not considered a person. You cannot, you do not have choices over what you do. You cannot, by extension, like protect your family. You cannot protect yourself. And that would have been the same in New York versus anywhere. So for a mother in New York, you could not protect your children from harm. You could not protect them from being separated from you or from being sexually or physically abused. And that I think is a very integral part of slavery that would have been the same everywhere. Now we also see though that even though yes, they were not working on sugar plantations, the labor that enslaved people in New York were doing was also physically very demanding. And we know this from remains that have been excavated that show like on the bones and such that they were doing really hard physical labor. We also can see this in what's referred to as the runaway slave ads. These notices in newspapers that were looking for enslaved people. In the case of New York, there are many of them who have had frostbite, who've had like, toes removed because of this. People who have various scarring because of the abuse that they endured. So the idea that slavery in New York somehow, like it's integral to you cannot have slavery if you do not have violence. And that's another really important part of it. Like you cannot enslave people without having a violent system doing so. And that would have been the same anywhere. So also in New York. Sorry, that's a long, like multiple point answer, but I hope it's clear.
That was crystal clear, and it is a really important answer. And I think that's especially your effort to sort of address the efforts in 19th century abolitionist literature and how it's written with a means or an end in mind to sort of absolve the abolitionists of the problem that their legacy of enslavement of people gives to them. So thank you for that. I think it's one of the most important elements of your book is helping us understand what slavery really is, regardless of where it is and what the people are doing. So you talk a little bit about particularly the records of the West India Company, but also you mentioned the records of the churches, which the Dutch Reformed Church in New York has a tremendously valuable archive and pretty extensive one. And you're able to tell fairly detailed stories about specific named individuals who were enslaved, which is a great challenge for many of the individuals who are trying to trace their ancestry, where there were enslaved individuals who were in their ancestry. How did the records of the New Netherland and maybe of the Dutch Reformed Church help you identify by name those who were enslaved?
Yeah. So it does become much more challenging in the 18th century, but for the 17th century, we have these records where enslaved people were named by first name and last name. And because we have their marriage and baptismal records, we also can kind of like trace their ancestry and their descendants. And so that's a really crucial record. But what really makes it possible to tell more complex stories about these people is then the records that are held in the New York State Archives, and it's the West India Company, like the council minutes and the Curacao records, like all these different records that are held at the New York State Archives that then also these same people appear in. And by putting that information together, so there's people who are baptized at a certain date, and then they appear in the records later on in the council records, asking for manumission and petitioning for manumission. And so you can see like, oh, this is how old this person is. Like, this is who their parents were. This is kind of like the broader history of this particular person. And so it's because of their names and because of those records, we're able to tell more complex stories. It's harder for the 18th and early 19th century. In the early 19th century, it becomes a little easier again, but the fact that enslaved people usually were only referred to by their first name, if mentioned at all, makes it much harder. They're not oftentimes in church records, which are really important also for free people of European descent today who are tracing their genealogy. Like, church records are really useful in that. And so when you don't have those types of records, it's much more difficult to do so.
And I'll put a shameless plug in for this New York State Archives. All of the records of the West India Company that are held by the archives have been digitized, indexed, and are available online through the State Archives website. And all of the records for which we have an English language translation, that translation is also available and searchable. So for those folks who are interested in sort of exploring some of those records on their own, you can do it from anywhere in the world. And we're very proud of the fact that we've been able to do that with the support of many, many people, including the New Netherland Institute. So we're proud of that. And another shameless plug. One of the things that we've seen is, particularly when you look at the early part of the 19th century and the latter part of the 18th century, court records and the court records of New York are also held by the State Archives. And we're anxious for scholars like you to explore those records and identify where enslaved individuals were able to use the courts to seek redress. But this is really about your book and not about the State Archive. So I want to continue on with a couple of questions. And you mentioned this earlier, but some enslaved individuals in New Netherlands were able to obtain their freedom, but that seemed to always come with some strings attached or a price. And one of the things that I thought was remarkable is while an individual may become maybe freed, again, it's conditional freedom, their children were not, and their children remained enslaved. But can you talk about some of the conditions or the strings that were attached for individuals who might have obtained their freedom from, particularly from the West India Company?
Yeah, so there's several cases. It was different every time. The most famous one is 1644, when 11 enslaved men petitioned the council for their freedom. They get this, but it's conditional, and that's the one where under the conditions are that they have to provide labor for the company if it needs them. So if it needs their assistance, they need to assist. If they have to pay yearly dues, and the last condition, their children will remain in bondage. And so that's the most famous one. These 11 men and their wives are obtaining their freedom, but their children remain in some form of bondage. There's some, different versions of what that bondage would have looked like. Now, there's other cases that are somewhat different. In 1662, for example, 3 enslaved women petitioned for their freedom, and they are freed, but under the condition that they return weekly to the house of Peter Stuyvesant, the governor at the time, director general, to clean the home. It's within like 3 to 4 months that one of those women, Maiken van Angola, actually petitions the council again, because at that point the other 2 women have passed away. She is old, she's tired, she has an injury, a chronic injury that is painful for her, and so she asks to be excused from having to clean Peter Stuyvesant's home, and it's granted at that point. And then there's another case where a group of enslaved men actually are freed, but under the condition that they return to work for the Dutch West India Company every other month. So 1 month they will be able to work for themselves, and the other month they work for the Dutch West India Company. And it alternates like that. So it's different every single time. And but there always are these certain conditions. And what's important here to also be mindful of, sometimes people will ask me, well, the 1644 case where they have to pay yearly dues and they actually could be required to work for the company whenever it would need them. This was also required of free white settlers. So it was the condition that their children remained enslaved that really distinguished them from, what normal circumstances were for free white people in the colony. They got land with this. The very important difference, though, is that when the council grants them this, it actually says that if they do not abide by these conditions, they would be re-enslaved. And no white free person would ever be enslaved for not paying their yearly dues. And so there definitely is a big difference there, in addition to the fact that their children remain enslaved. But those are the conditions, different every time. Yeah, and always in response to these people petitioning the council.
When an individual was given this conditional freedom, were they able to move away from the colony, and did they settle in a particular area or anything like that, or did they continue to cohabitate as they had before?
So they got land just north of New Amsterdam, in the area that's now like Greenwich Village. They were able to settle there on that land, and the deeds are actually also at the New York State Archives, I believe. So the land deeds are there that actually name them and the areas that they were settling in. And I think that this one was, though, so technically maybe they could have moved out of the colony, but in reality they could not, because first of all, they had land, so that was a way to tie them to the land. That's not an easy thing to get. if their children remain in bondage, you do not want to leave your children behind. So that's one other way of tying them to the land. And so having them, being able to tying them to the land, then within that conditional freedom, they still serve the purpose for the Dutch West India Company of actually helping the Dutch West India Company people the land when it was struggling to get Dutch settlers to do so, because most Dutch people were not really interested in traveling to this, faraway colony and try to establish themselves there. So there was still a way that they were able to take advantage of these people and kind of make them be useful to the Dutch colonial project, if you will.
You start the book off with the story of your visit to the House of Slaves in Senegal, and the reaction that you had, the physical and emotional reaction that you had when you entered that structure. Are there places in New York that people can visit today to get a real physical sense of what these places of enslavement actually entail?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are. There's, I had this very strong response at Gore Island in a way that I haven't had in other spaces, except for maybe climbing up the stairs at the Lot House. And I'll show you some images in a minute of some of those spaces. But there are more and more historic homes in New Orleans, hear me, in New York that that make an effort to actually have people access those spaces. What comes to mind is like the Dyckman Farmhouse, the historic Huguenot Street. Those are some of the places where you can actually go into the spaces where enslaved people lived, and learn more about their histories and kind of really be in that space. Phillipsburg Manor is another space where you can really kind of experience that. I don't know if it's open, but the Maybe Farm in Schenectady, there is the outdoor kitchen that also has this space where the enslaved people lived. So there are several. I'm just mentioning a few. Kralo is another one, or Krylo, how do you say it? Where also you can actually visit the space, the cellar area where usually the kitchen would have been, and where in most cases enslaved people would have done a lot of the labor, and oftentimes also lived and spent a lot of their time in those spaces. So yes, there are various historic homes, and there are many more, but there's various historic homes that you can visit to actually see these. And I don't know if should I pull up the slides and kind of show?
That would be great. That would be wonderful. And while you're doing that, I'll just remind everyone, Fort Kralo, located in Rensselaer, New York. It's a state historic site. I think they close seasonally, but again, it's easy to get to and wonderful. The historic Huguenot Street down in the Hudson Valley. The Dyckman Farm on the northern part of New York City, and the Maybe Farm, which is run by the Schenectady County Historical Society right over in Rotterdam. Again, all very easy to get to if you live in the Capital District, but they're in lots of other places. So
yeah. So let me, I mentioned, okay, there it is. So you mentioned the Maison des Esclaves in Gore Island in Senegal. I visited that in 2010, and at the time I was finishing up my dissertation, and so I'd been working on the topic for a while. But it was in that space that I really had, a kind of a physical reaction to being in that space, and it spoke to me in a way that I didn't expect, because, if you read so much about slavery, you don't necessarily, get surprised by the responses and kind of the way that history, to the history itself. But I had in this space, I had a very kind of instantly feeling physically ill. And that made me think about the spaces and actually visiting the spaces where enslaved people would have lived and worked and worshiped, and to see what being in those spaces would be able to, how that would help me tell the story, the story of slavery in New York. And so when I came back to the States, I visited many of these different spaces whenever I had an opportunity. And this is the Lot House, which I just mentioned, which was where The enslaved people mentioned here likely lived, so Mary, Hannah, Mel, Kate, Harry, Hector, Powell, and the children, we don't know if they were their children, but the children, Cyrus, Jan, Jacob, Hannah, and Paul. And it's at the Lot House. So this was the initial building right here, this part of the structure. And then there was this lean-to added to it that had a kitchen in it, which was like kitchen and workplace. And groundskeeper at some point discovered that in a closet in that kitchen, the ceiling actually opened up to this little stairwell that was right here. So you could like pull out the stairs and that would bring you to this stairwell. And on both sides, there were garret spaces, and this is one of them. I visited this space, took pictures with my iPhone, and you can barely see it. It is so dark, no natural light whatsoever in this space. These are images taken by a professional photographer with lighting, and that's why we can see what these spaces look like. You would not be able to stand in them. They would have been very hot in the summer. There was a chimney running through one of these garret spaces, this one with a beehive-style oven, so enslaved people in that space would have been able to at least get some warmth from that in the winters. All of these people likely lived in those two garret spaces. One of those garret spaces had a lock on the outside of the door. It's not, determined for sure what that was for, but it's possible that that was used to lock enslaved people in at night. These garret spaces would have been this area of that lean-to building. And so this door that you see here was a door to this particular space, which was the attic where the Lot family would have slept. So like I said, going into this space was a very kind of visceral experience as well, moving up that stairwell. And it really helps you kind of think about the fact that when you're walking through that space, this area is in no way, shape, or form similar to where the Lot family would have spent most of their times. I also visited the Schuyler Mansion, which of course is another one of those sites. I didn't mention it because I'm not sure if they actually, when I visited, they didn't actually take people into the spaces where enslaved people likely would have lived. And in fact, there's some debate whether or not it would have been in the attic or in the cellar. I believe it was in the cellar of the Schuyler Mansion. There are some records that actually mention them in the cellar. It also architecturally makes more sense because the cellar actually only had one exit and entry point, which would have been at the back of the building here. And that went into this walled courtyard that you see here on this model of the home. And so that actually would have contained a lot of the labor and the activities of the enslaved people, the people enslaved by the Schuyler family. And then there were these windows in the back of the building that actually would have allowed from the stairwell a view over that courtyard and the activities in that particular space. It also was a way to hide the enslaved labor from guests to kind of create this more manicured space. And that was also very common at Southern plantation homes. So it's a model we see elsewhere as well. Now, one of the things that, and this is something that I didn't mention, but if anybody is interested in experiencing these spaces of enslavement and they have an opportunity to participate in the Slave Dwelling Project, I absolutely recommend it. I participated in this at Stenton Hall in Philadelphia, so not New York. I didn't have that opportunity, but it is a Georgian-style home, very similar to the Tim Brook Mansion or the Schuyler Mansion. And what Joe McGill, who's the founder of the Dwelling Project, what he does is that he actually takes people into those spaces and actually stay overnight in those spaces. So we slept in the garret space at Stenton Hall. This was the space where we spent the night. One of the things that I really learned from that experience was actually the sounds of the house and how in the middle of the night, any movement in another space, you could hear it so like it was next to you in that garret space. And that actually made me think about how enslaved people would have been able to move through those spaces unnoticed. Like, what would have been the possibilities to actually, leave those spaces at night to meet family members without being noticed by your enslaver. So it was a very impressive experience, and I absolutely recommend it to people if they're interested. I also visited the churches that enslaved people worshipped in, and one of them being the Reformed Church of Shangang. What I really like about this church, and it's actually the same with the Fishkill Church, is that you can actually see the the old architecture of the church. So this was actually initially the entrance, when it was more like a square type of building. The pulpit would have been right across from that, and the galleries would have been higher up, and those were predominantly meal spaces, whereas women and children would have been on the first floor, and enslaved people likely would have been on the first floor as well. Except for elders and older men, they would have been on the first floor as well. We see that in the 18th century, in a lot of these churches, they changed the organization and they lowered the galleries to the balconies. And enslaved people usually were located in the back, either on the first or the second floor. And one of the things that I did then was to actually visit those spaces, visit those churches, and also sit in those pews to kind of also think about what that would have meant. Who could see you? Who could you see? One of the things you could not see or barely see is the minister. It also would have been more difficult to actually hear the preaching from where you were seated. We know from Black congregants in New England churches who would have had similar seating arrangements, how they experienced it as humiliating, as kind of, feeling like they're just put in various like small spaces, nooks and cracks in the churches, not really being able to participate. We also know, and this is the First Church of Albany, and you can see here from on the left that they also were oftentimes moved around in the church depending on the people around them. So in 1815, Daniel Winna informed the treasury that he would pay for his pew, but only if the consistory would remove the Blacks from behind the pew, as was understood. And there's several other cases in the First Church of Albany where we see those types of discussions where they actually do not want the physical proximity of Black people in that space of the church. I also went to the spaces in New Netherlands that we read about in the records. And so the West India Company slaves actually, the people enslaved by the Dutch West India Company, many of them lived right here on the Slijksteeg, which is now South William Street. And this is actually a picture of, I believe, what is the location. I did a very, I really tried to approximate this as closely as I could. As you could see, it's now a parking garage. Being in that area and kind of walking to the different other locations in that area helped me think about the access that they had. So, for example, there was a tavern right on the corner of their street. There also was one around the corner right here, number 3, which apparently was their preferred space, tavern. There was also one right here where we know some enslaved men met during service on Sunday, which makes sense that they would have met at the tavern right here because the church was there. So it's the farthest away from the church. We know that they were accessing the court, which was right here. So that wouldn't have been very far from their home. Of course, the fort and the council would have been right here. All of this very close to each other, very close proximity to each other. And in fact, one thing to always keep in mind is that Manhattan was much smaller then than it is now. So when you go to that area south of Wall Street, You can see here the overlay of the map on what Manhattan looks like now. It was a much smaller space than it is now. And so it would have been, like a 5-10 minute walk to go to some of these spaces. So it enabled enslaved people to also access the courts and the church and the taverns, because they were living close to them. And finally, I just wanted to include this. I mentioned Maiken as one of the enslaved women who was able to obtain conditional freedom, and then returned to the council to be released from having to clean Stuyvesant's home on a weekly basis. So their home was on the corner of Houston Street and Bowery, which is a photograph of it here. Whenever I'm in New York, I tend to gravitate to this area and kind of walk around and think about the people who were living there, but also thinking about, again, the proximity. How far was this really from New Amsterdam? How far would they have to walk to be able to access the town, which they did not live in? And what did that mean for their experiences in this area? And those are just some of the spaces I frequented, and I just wanted to include this because, if you want to ask any other questions, you can always do so. And I do sometimes do stuff on X. I was more active on Twitter than I am on X, but you can follow me there, and you can also purchase the book if you want to. It is available. I know on Amazon and Cornell, but I know Historic Homes also have it. So those are some of the spaces that I would visit and kind of, try to use the architecture and the physical space to tell a story of slavery in New York where the records don't always provide us that context. That's where actually the built environment and architecture and geography can help us tell a fuller story. I'm going to stop sharing now, if that's okay.
Well, it's perfect. But I think you've given us a great opportunity here, because buy the book. I highly recommend the book if you haven't read it already. But then use some of these wonderful examples that Dr. Mosterman has just given us and visit those spaces to get a much more complete story. And you can feel it as well as understand it intellectually. I know there are a few questions that have piled up, so I'll ask Josie if she wants to come back and go through a few of those questions that folks have submitted.
Yeah, there are quite a few questions. There are a couple of them that are relating to the differences between indentured servants and enslaved people. So I'm going to try to combine two of those. What was the ratio of white indentured and Black indentured servants to the enslaved population? And what, if any, differences were there in the work performed by indentured servants and enslaved people?
That's a great question. I actually don't know what the ratio was. There were in New Netherlands, there were indentured servants. There's actually, we have the records of the people that were brought to the colony. These were usually people who already knew who they would be working for. So it wasn't the way that we see in Virginia or later on in New York, perhaps, where large numbers of indentured servants are being shipped to the colony, and then they end up working for various people. Usually they knew the families. They knew what they were going to New Netherlands for. And we have those records. They're at the Amsterdam City Archives. The numbers, there's an old article on this by Van den Boogaard is the last name, and he talks about this in great detail. So that might be useful for the people that are interested in this. The ratio, I'm not sure. I think it depends on where in the colony you would be. So in the Rensselaerswijk area, there would have been more indentured servants. In the New Amsterdam area, the enslaved population, according to some calculations of historians, was about 30% in like the 1640s. I don't know how accurate that calculation is, but I do think that it was a significant number. If we look at the church records, we see that a lot of enslaved people, appear in those records in comparison to white people. So it would have been a significant number, but I don't know exact ratios. as for the labor, I mean, again, in New Netherlands, it would have been very different because most of the enslaved people worked for the Dutch West India Company. And so they would have done, you know, the labor of like digging the canal and building the roads, which, you know, there's several actually white convicts who are convicted to work alongside the enslaved people of the Dutch West India Company. So the labor that the enslaved people were doing was actually considered like labor for somebody, you know, convicted of a crime. So it definitely was a different type of labor. But, you know, if we think about farming, we do also see enslaved people and indentured servants working alongside on certain farms. So it's a mixture, and it's not an easy to answer question.
Okay, how about did the Dutch Reformed Church allow racial intermarriage, and is there any record of that happening?
So there's some great work done on this by Deborah Hamer, who's now the director of the New Netherland Institute. Sophie White is a Dutch historian whose book is actually coming out soon, who talks about marriage in and interracial marriage in the Dutch Reformed Church globally. In the case of New York, there are a few instances in the latter part of the 17th century where you see interracial marriages. But I personally have not seen it beyond that. In the 18th century, I've not seen it. I don't know if there was an explicit like mandate on that though. I think that the complication was more so with I mean, there is in the 17th century actually like a law, but that focuses more so on heathen versus black. So it's a little bit, you know, it could be read in various ways. But so there are a few examples of this happening. I don't think there's particularly like a legislation that actually says there cannot be interracial marriages anywhere. But it happens very rarely.
Okay, and do you think that the Dutch deliberately gave the freed people land in what's today Greenwich Village as a buffer against the indigenous people? Was that a major purpose, or was it just land that was available?
I think it's definitely part of it. There's several scholars who have written about this, like Thelma Wills Foote, Leslie Harris, Christopher Moore wrote about this. And this was during Kief's War that they were given this land, which of course was a period of a lot of warfare in this area where these Dutch settlements were really threatened. And so the fact that the Dutch were giving them land in that area that is north of New Amsterdam definitely would have helped with securing its colonial town. So I have no doubt that that was one of the reasons. I don't think it's the only reason. Like also, I think that they didn't have land and want to give them land within New Amsterdam itself. So there's a variety of reasons, I think, but I think that that is one of them.
Okay, and do you think that the changes over time that you had described as far as more restrictions, more regulation, are the result of Dutch to English control, or more just changes between the 17th and 18th centuries, like we see in Virginia?
It's very similar to Virginia, and I'm glad that that's mentioned in the question, but because oftentimes it is seen as like a Dutch versus English period, but as this person is pointing out, in Virginia in the 17th century, we also see that enslaved people are able to obtain freedom, that there's, you know, like no clear legislation when it comes to slavery and enslaved people, and that does not start until the latter part of the 17th century. And we see the same thing in New York. And so I'm actually sure it has nothing to do with Dutch versus English control, but rather the changes in slavery and the changes more globally when it comes to the transatlantic slave trade, being more focused on actually bringing in enslaved Africans into the colony. but also the fact that now it's it's expanding, it's growing, it's individuals who are enslaving people, and all of that requires legislation. Again, like I mentioned earlier, you cannot have slavery without violence. You could also not have slavery without like these types of mechanisms that help you control a growing and safe population. And so that is where we see in New York, as slavery is expanding, that those laws also become more important. And to that point, some of these laws are actually implemented after the slave revolt in New York City in 1712, where they actually, you know, have a real life example of enslaved people killing enslavers and starting this revolt. That in response to that, and earlier on in 1708, the Hallett murder, where two enslaved people murder their enslavers in Queens, in Long Island. Those cases you actually see in the legislation that they respond to those directly by implementing stricter slave laws.
Great. So I think we'll end it with one last question. This is a great question. So you have your book, Spaces of Enslavement, which I think came out of your dissertation, but someone would like to actually look up a copy of your dissertation, which is the dream when you've written one, that somebody wants to find a copy. So what school was that for, and how could somebody look up a copy of it?
You know, I don't even know. Like, I know the school, obviously. But so that was for Boston University. I did my PhD there, finished in 2011. And I think that because it was restricted at some point, and I think it might still be. So then when you email the librarian and then they email me and then I give permission, I don't even know if I have a copy of it. Like, I honestly like don't know, but I would be happy to check if somebody wants to read it. I don't necessarily recommend reading it. I think the book is a much better version of the history. But in those cases, like if you really want to read the dissertation, those would be some of the, so either email the librarian at BU or email me and I'll see if I have it. And if not, then you could still get it via BU. Or maybe it's online at, I don't know, I don't remember where they put dissertations, but there's also this online platform.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank you for joining us today. This has been an excellent presentation. There's lots of comments in the Q&A to that effect, so people really enjoyed it. And thank you to everybody who joined us today. If you're interested in learning more about what we do, visit nysarchivestrust.org, and you can visit the State Archives website to find all of those great records that we've been talking about, archives.nysed.gov. It's our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's history alive. If you're interested in the content we create and would like to see some more of it, please contact us at aptrust@nysed.gov to receive a free past issue of New York Archives magazine. And please join us for our next online speaker series, A Woman's Place, the History of the New York State Women's Division, on March 12th at 12:30. And you can register for that and learn more about it at nysarchivestrust.org. Thanks again so much, Andrea and Tom. It was a great presentation. Thank you for your time.